All right, folks, welcome back to the FITSNews studios for the latest edition of the Week in Review, our second edition of the new year 2023. We got a lot to hit. We have not talked much about the Murdaughs lately, but we're going to change that in this episode. A huge block of Murdaugh news as we approach that big double homicide trial in Walterboro, South Carolina on January 23rd, just around the corner, folks. In addition to that, we're going to talk about some legislative drama that boiled over at the State House in Columbia, South Carolina this week. A big political segment where we get into party disunity. And folks, guess what? It's a bipartisan issue. Republicans and Democrats, some serious drama and defections within their ranks. We're also going to talk about Cheer Inc., folks. An incredibly compelling interview that Jen Wood, our research director, did with the first survivor of that scandal to come forward and tell their story. All that and more heading your way on the Week in Review. All right, so we've been fairly light on Murdaugh coverage for the last two episodes of this show because it's been fairly quiet on the Murdaugh front as all sides get ready for the big trial coming up in Walterboro, South Carolina. We are now, as we film this, less than 10 days away, people. Big event coming up in Walterboro, South Carolina, starting on January 23rd. And as we get prepared for this, as we are organizing, getting our logistics lined up about who's going to be where, covering what, as many other media outlets are doing, there's a huge debate taking place behind the scenes about that access, about media coverage of this trial, about who's going to be in the courtroom, who's not, what's going to be allowed in the courtroom, what's not, and of interest, what courtroom materials are going to be publicly available and not. So I want to dive into these. Did a big column yesterday, Friday, related to this story, and it covered a number of these key points of deliberation. I want to start out with the first one, which relates to media access, just fundamental access. And before I get into this, I want to credit Judge Clifton Newman, because up to this point, as it relates to this trial, Judge Newman has been an absolute champion of transparency. He has allowed unfettered media access to these proceedings, whether it's videotaping, photography, live streaming, and that has given the public a live look at this case as it has progressed over the last few months. And that's been very important because, as I've noted repeatedly, this is not just a trial of Alec Murdaugh. Our entire justice system here in South Carolina, in a lot of ways, is on trial as it relates to this case. And so this news outlet has praised Judge Newman for that. And in doing so, we have called on other judges to adopt his patterns here, to adopt his method of providing that kind of unfettered access. Because, again, in South Carolina, let me just briefly educate you, if you're not from the Palmetto State, on how this works. In South Carolina, it is literally up to the individual judge to decide whether access is allowed, period, and if so, what level of access is allowed for the media. In fact, just this past week, we were in Lexington County, and a circuit court judge there said no live streaming, no videos. You're allowed to take notes and take pictures. That's it. Obviously, Judge Newman set a much higher, more transparent bar for the Murdaugh case, and good for him. That's absolutely necessary. But there needs to be a standard. And I wrote a big column back in December of 2021, a column where I actually called out a few judges for their failure to provide for a transparent courtroom environment. And so it was good to see Judge Newman from the very beginning of this story be a champion for transparency. But as we approach this trial, as we move from the pretrial phase to the actual main event here, the double homicide trial of Alec Murdaugh, questions have been raised by members of the media, rightfully so, justifiably so, regarding the current plan of media access for this trial. And I want to now address some of those points. First and foremost, questions have been raised about which media outlets are going to be allowed into the trial and how many media outlets will be allowed into the trial. And so if you haven't been following this, two decisions have been made by the court, which I do support. Number one is to have Court TV be the one outlet which provides a live stream of these proceedings. And this is smart because it would keep 50 different media outlets from trying to set up cameras for their own live feed. This would allow one outlet to do that and provide that to all the media outlets. And again, assuming that feed is shared with everyone evenly and equally, and I'm talking print, broadcast, podcasters, internet sites, as long as that is shared evenly and freely with everyone, got no problem with that. It keeps the courtroom from getting cluttered. So no issue with that. Similarly, a decision has been made to have a pool photographer. And again, I've been enjoying trying my hand at the amateur photography during these various court hearings of the last few months. I think I've done okay with it. Not as good as Jen Wood, our research director. She's an amazing photographer too, by the way. But I understand this too. You shouldn't have a million shutters clicking. Just have one pool photographer. And again, as long as those images are made available to all the media outlets covering this trial, no problem with that either. Judge Newman and court officials are doing their best to keep this from becoming a circus, and I respect them for that. But when we start talking about who's going to be in the courtroom, I do think we need to think about a few things. Number one, we need to think about the media outlets that have been covering this story from the beginning, particularly these South Carolina-based media outlets, which have been covering this story from the beginning. And I would argue that if you've got a media outlet, and again, not just FITSNews, there's podcasters that have been doing this. There's mainstream media outlets like the Charleston Post and Courier, the state newspaper, the Greenville News, reporters like Avery Wilkes, John Monk, Michael DeWitt. These are guys who have been breaking stories along with FITSNews from the beginning. If you shut outlets like ours out in exchange for national outlets that are just trying to parachute in at the last minute and make a bunch of money off of it, I don't think that's fair. I think that the reporters who have been covering this trial from the beginning ought to have some preference when it comes to being allowed access to the courtroom. Now, again, I'm not going to whine and complain if I don't make the cut. I think FITSNews' body of work on the Murdaugh murder saga is pretty much without equal. So I'm happy to stand on our laurels there. But when it comes to the reporters that are granted access into that courtroom, this is where I want to make a very clear point. At this point, reporters are not being allowed to bring laptops and cell phones into the courtroom. And that's one I don't understand. I don't understand that. I understand the limiting the number of cameras in the court, limiting the number of videos. I certainly understand that, support that. But to tell a reporter you can't bring your computer in the court to cover this trial, I mean, that strikes me as unfair. And it strikes me as something that would materially limit the free flow of information from this trial. Because, again, a live stream is great, but it doesn't capture everything. And if you, again, got reporters who've been covering this from the beginning, not being able to document in real time what's happening, I think that's a problem. And certainly there should be restrictions on that usage. For example, if the judge wants to say, hey, you can't take cell phone pictures, totally understand that. Completely understand that. If some idiot leaves their phone on, the Jay-Z ringtone or whatever, you want to throw them out, whatever, fine. I don't think Judge Newman would throw somebody out for a Jay-Z ringtone, but maybe he would. Either way, those rules, I have no problem with that. But again, we've got to be able to do our jobs, folks. We got to be able to do our jobs, and not allowing laptops and cell phones materially limits our ability to do our jobs when it comes to this trial. But the big issue, once you get past who's going to sit where and what equipment they're going to be allowed to bring in, which I think Judge Newman and court officials will get to a fair resolution there. But the bigger issue is the question of whether or not certain exhibits are going to be made public or not. Now, folks, we're going to see some incredibly graphic things at this trial. Again, if you've read FITSNews coverage, you know that some of the images and videos that are going to be presented, likely by prosecutors, related to these charges are going to be beyond graphic, traumatizing, horrific. And so I certainly understand the desire to limit, protect, have some sort of cover over some of that. I understand the desire to do that, but, and here's the but, as bad as these things are, they are public documents. They are being presented at a public trial by public prosecutors in a public courtroom. There is literally no conception of public document that does not apply to any exhibit, any piece of evidence, any photo, any video, any document, anything submitted into evidence in this trial has to be made available. It has to be made available. And then that's up to the individual media outlet to determine what it does with that information. Again, the only exceptions to this rule that I've ever seen that I believe are appropriate are images involving children or things of that nature, or sexually explicit type matter involving children. Anything else, to me, that's a public document. That's fair game. And again, my suggestion in the column that I printed just yesterday was that the court officials or Judge Newman or the Walterboro folks that have been doing such a great job getting ready for this Murdaugh-palooza. Again, I don't want any of this to come off as a criticism of any of these folks, because they're grappling with a ton of stuff. They're doing an amazing job trying to get to a proper resolution. But my idea for them was to create just a Murdaugh media listserv where any media outlet, whether they're in Walterboro at the time of the trial or covering it from afar, you sign up for this email list, and when these exhibits are introduced, boom, out goes the email with the files. So that way everybody gets it at the same time, and then it's up to each individual media outlet to figure out how they are going to handle that information. But again, bottom line is you cannot conceal public documents, people. Just can't do it. And so any discussion of whether or not to release certain exhibits from this trial, I hope that's not even a discussion, because again, those are public documents. They have to be made publicly available. Now, how's FITSNews going to cover this trial? I'm incredibly excited about what we've got lined up. We're planning early next week to publish a report which details a lot of our planning. We've got Ash Meservey from down in the Low Country is going to be spearheading our coverage as our lead anchor producer. Ash has already been hard at work down in Walterboro with our team, filming, getting B-roll ready, planning, getting all of our offerings lined up. Jen Wood, Dylan Nolan, our research director and director of special projects, respectively, they've been doing incredible work prepping for this trial. In fact, Jen Wood had a piece just this week on jury selection we're going to talk about in a moment. It's just amazing prep work for this trial to get readers educated and up to speed on what to expect when this circus begins. But looking forward next week to revealing all of our Murdaugh coverage plans. And again, I want to thank everybody who's been following us from the very beginning on this story. We have led the coverage on this from the beginning. We are going to continue to lead it during this trial. And again, count on FITSNews to continue to fight for judicial transparency as the Murdaugh murders, crime and corruption trial comes to a head. All right, so as we approach this trial, I just got through with a long segment on the media covering the Murdaugh murders trial, but the big question is the 12 people who are going to decide Alec Murdaugh's fate, the jury. Again, at the end of the day, those are the only perceptions that will matter when it comes to the outcome of this case. Our research director, Jen Wood, as part of her ongoing trial prep, pre-trial education pieces, has published an excellent report on jury selection. Here's a quick clip from Jen's report.
Over the past few weeks, 900 residents of Colleton County received a jury summons from the clerk of court for the highly anticipated trial of disbarred attorney and accused murderer Alec Murdaugh. This trial is scheduled to begin on January 23, 2023 in Walterboro, South Carolina. Murdaugh has been charged with the murder of his wife and son at their Islandton home in Colleton County on June 7, 2021. Given Murdaugh's deep ties to the community, the selection of a fair and impartial jury has been a hot topic of discussion across South Carolina leading up to the trial. The process of selecting a jury is a key component of ensuring Murdaugh's right to a trial by an impartial jury. Today, we're going to take a look at how this process works. The jury selection process begins every year in September when the South Carolina Department of Motor Vehicles sends an electronic file to the State Election Commission. This file contains the name, address, date of birth, social security number, sex, and race of anyone who is over the age of 18 years and are citizens of the United States who hold a valid South Carolina driver's license or identification card. The file also includes the names of people who obtained South Carolina driver's licenses the previous year and excludes persons whose driver's licenses or identification cards have not been renewed or have been invalidated by judicial or administrative action. In October, this list is then sent to the jury commissioners for each county. The jury commission is often the clerk of court or deputy clerk of court for the county, but in some instances it is made up of multiple county employees. So for example, in Lexington County, the county auditor, the county treasurer, and the clerk of court of common pleas serve as the jury commission. This list provided by the State Election Commission becomes the official list of eligible jurors in the county for each year.
All right, thanks, Jen Wood, for that amazing report. By the way, if you missed it, Jen Wood had an incredible report earlier this week on FITSNews.com about Alec Murdaugh's tombstone friends. In case you missed that, be sure to go to FITSNews. Just Google FITSNews Murdaugh tombstone. You'll pull that report up. Jen's report based on a filing from Amy Zimmercheck, the attorney for Curtis Eddie Smith, Cousin Eddie, who, again, if you recall, defense attorneys accused him of being the trigger man in the double homicide of which Alec Murdaugh currently stands accused. Zimmercheck has been pushing back against that since October when that allegation was first made, and her latest filing delves into a group of people who could be implicated in this criminal network revolving around Alec Murdaugh, potentially even the double homicide there at Moselle back in June 2021. If you missed that report, be sure to check it out on FITSNews.com. Jen Wood doing amazing work on the Murdaugh saga. All right, so it was a huge week this week in Columbia, South Carolina on the Republican loyalty oath. If you follow this news outlet, you know we've been covering this for several weeks. And in fact, I had some choice words on this subject last month in Colleton County. Let's take a look at that. But one last thing on this loyalty oath, folks. If your lawmaker comes to you, you need to ask them if they signed that list. Because if they did, folks, they're a coward. They're a coward. They are surrendering their ability to represent you effectively by basically saying that they are going to march in lockstep with the GOP leadership. That is not the kind of person you want representing you in Columbia. You want a free thinker. You want someone who can acknowledge that the inefficiencies, the inequities, the injustices of the current system in Columbia and stand up for you, not for those Republican leaders who are under the thumb of the special interests. So again, when your lawmaker comes to your local diner, to your coffee shop, or shows up on your porch looking for a vote next election, ask them if they signed that loyalty oath. And if they did, they're not the leader for you. All right, so I'm obviously pretty staked out on this front. But over the last few weeks, as lawmakers have come back to Columbia, South Carolina for the 125th session of the General Assembly, been trying to get more details on exactly what's happening with regard to this oath. Are House Republicans going to insist on this sort of Stalin-esque tactic to allow these lawmakers admission? The answer to that question, folks, is yes. Earlier this week, FITSNews covered exclusively a meeting at the Palmetto Club, a prestigious club, private facility located across the street from the South Carolina State House in downtown Columbia. And according to my sources, nearly 24 members of the Freedom Caucus, a group of conservative lawmakers who are part of that supermajority in the South Carolina House of Representatives. According to my sources, these lawmakers, more than 18 of them, potentially as many as 22 of them, physically denied entry to a meeting of the Republican caucus. Now, I'm told that a handful of these Freedom Caucus members were eventually allowed inside to plead their case with the Republican majority, with the leadership of the GOP-controlled South Carolina House. But the outcome of that meeting, again, still up in the air. In fact, here's a segment from our report earlier this week on the loyalty oath. Representative, obviously a tense discussion in there. Can you tell us anything about what transpired inside the Palmetto Club today with the Republican caucus gathering?
Unfortunately, due to confidentiality rule that has kind of always been affected caucus, I can't tell you. We're bound by confidentiality, so wish I could. Would love for people to know.
Do you think folks will know at some point in this process what the resolution of this dispute was?
I'm not sure. I hope so. So,
how do you think the dispute will impact the ability of the Republican supermajority to govern this session?
I think I better be done there and make sure I don't say anything that might breach confidentiality. So,
understood.
But thank you for asking and thank you for what you do.
Sure. Thank you as well. Representative, thank you. So politicians not talking. That's a new one for me, but there you have it from Adam Morgan, one of the leaders of the 18 lawmakers that declined to sign this confidentiality agreement. Count on FITSNews to keep you posted on the latest on this Republican Party battle. So as you see from that clip, lawmakers very reticent to talk about what transpired within these meetings, or attempted meetings as the case may be, because again, there's a confidentiality rule for GOP caucus meetings that precludes members from commenting on what transpires within the meeting. So it's kind of like the Fight Club. The first rule is you don't talk about it, apparently, although judging from the looks of these lawmakers, I don't know how many of them are going to be battling fisticuffs. But here's the point. Anything like this, any sort of attempt to impose demands like this on lawmakers, again, totally out of whack. It's totally out of line, and it's totally inconsistent with these lawmakers advancing the best interests of their constituents. There's something I want to point out here. Lawmakers who are supporting the Republican majority and imposing this oath, they insist they are only requiring that these lawmakers do not campaign against incumbent Republicans. Well, again, that's bad enough. If you've got a terrible Republican lawmaker, why shouldn't they be allowed to campaign against that lawmaker, right? I mean, it makes sense to me. But that definition of campaign activities is what is driving this debate. According to the Republican majority, they're simply saying you can't campaign against our incumbents. But the members of the Freedom Caucus have told me no, the definition has been expanded to include things like taking pictures of the voting board, because this is a way that lawmakers are held accountable. You have a conservative member following a vote, pulls out their cell phone and takes a picture of the electronic voting board in the South Carolina House, which shows a tally of who voted how on certain issues. In fact, this news outlet used those pictures extensively during the debate last year over medical marijuana. It's a way to help hold lawmakers accountable, because again, why have public votes if you can't publicize those votes? But again, according to some of the members of this Freedom Caucus in the South Carolina House, they've been told that if they take those pictures of the voting board, that they are shaming their colleagues and that constitutes, yes, a campaign activity. Again, I think it's bull. I think all of this is Stalin-esque nonsense. But again, this is where we are in the Republican-controlled General Assembly in South Carolina. As I noted earlier this week, Republicans have controlled government in South Carolina for more than 2 decades. They have 6 of 7 congressional districts. They have every single statewide constitutional office. They have a supermajority in the South Carolina House. And now, with the decision of Mia McLeod to lead the Democratic Party, which we'll talk about in just a second, a supermajority in the Senate. What have they done with these overwhelming levers of power that they control, that they have absolutely total control over? Folks, South Carolina still has super high taxes, the highest income tax rates in the Southeast. Academic outcomes, NAEP, Nation's Report Card, that are lagging behind the rest of the country. And South Carolina is already at the bottom of the barrel academically. We've got infrastructure that's falling apart despite huge tax increases on gasoline. We've got a public justice system that continues to let violent criminals free, re-victimizing victims and endangering public safety. We've got government running power companies, running ports, running hospital systems. And this is a Republican legislature? These are what Republican rulers are doing? Doesn't make sense, does it? Which is probably why for the last 3 years running, the American Conservative Union has ranked the South Carolina General Assembly as the most liberal Republican legislature in America. And folks, that is what this loyalty oath is about. It's about keeping the handful of lawmakers who want to change that from calling out their colleagues and holding them accountable. And once again, I said it before, anyone signing that oath in my book is a coward and doesn't deserve your vote. All right, so if you follow FITSNews, you know we are decidedly anti-partisan. We're not bipartisan. We're not partisan Republican, partisan Democrat. We basically, it's a pox on all their houses, folks. The two-party system, as I noted in a segment earlier this month on this show, a calamitous failure on all fronts. Republican control, Democrat control, makes no difference. So just to be clear, it wasn't just Republicans that had a bit of intra-party drama this week in Columbia, South Carolina. On the day the legislative session kicked off, January 10, 2023, State Senator Mia McLeod issued a Declaration of Independence. Now, McLeod, if you're familiar with her, we've written on her extensively, a staunch progressive, a very hardcore to the left of the spectrum on the Democratic side, but a populist Democrat who ran against Joe Cunningham in the Democratic primary. And as we reported at the time, party officials did everything they could to keep this race on the DL, to not have debates, to not publicize this election, because again, the party wanted lily white, moderate Joe Cunningham, the former congressman. They wanted him to be their nominee. And guess what? They got what they wanted. They got Joe Cunningham as their nominee, and he got absolutely crushed in November. The so-called electable Democrat trounced, folks, by a massive double-digit margin, one of the biggest Republican wins at the statewide level, again, in the last 2.5 decades since the GOP has been controlling the state. But McLeod announced on Tuesday that she was leaving the Democratic Party. And basically, she said a lot of the same things we've been saying, that they are a party that is adopting failed strategies to win elections. It's on repeat, she said, on repeat, the same failed ideas, same failed strategies, same failed nominees. And again, she said, I'm not going to be a part of it anymore. Now, I spoke with State Representative Todd Rutherford, who's the minority leader in the South Carolina House of Representatives, shortly after Mia McLeod made her declaration. Rutherford was hot, people. He called her a sore loser. He basically said that she was issuing an indictment of herself, not the party, because according to him, she is the party. But again, very tense moments there between those two Democratic leaders. Well, one of them, I guess, is now a former Democratic leader. But McLeod wasn't the only Democrat to leave the party. We actually, in addition to having her leave to become an independent, a congressional candidate from the last election cycle, Judd Larkins, who ran against Joe Wilson in the South Carolina 2nd Congressional District, he's actually flipping to the Republican Party. So he's not becoming an independent. He's actually flipping all the way over. Now, will Larkins campaign for that congressional seat again as a member of the GOP? We'll have to see. Don't know yet what his plans are, but as FITSNews exclusively reported yesterday, he's flipping parties. So again, it's not just Republicans in disarray, it's Democrats who are seeing defections from their ranks as well. And guys, I just got to say, this is a good thing. I've been saying this for years. These party divisions, this two-party structure, whether at the state level, the national level, it has done nothing to address the core issues that are dragging this state and this country down. And I'm talking about fiscal profligacy that's putting future generations at risk. I'm talking about a lack of commitment to some of the core functions of government. And I'm talking about allowing corruption to fester, again, at every level of government. And if you follow our coverage of South Carolina's judicial system, you know exactly what we're talking about. A system that is supposed to protect people, that is supposed to be blind, that is supposed to follow standards and fairness and fundamental equality, that is instead blinking at every turn based on the powerful lawyer legislators who are appointing judges in the state. And again, thank God we're finally seeing some breaks within this two-party structure, because if we finally start getting more choices at the ballot box, people, if we finally start getting real pressure on some of these parties to break this failed mold, maybe we'll start seeing the progress that South Carolina needs and deserves if it is ever going to move forward as a state. All right, so this has been a jam-packed episode already, but before we go, I couldn't conclude this episode without a reference to probably one of the most emotional, riveting, passionate, important interviews that this news outlet has ever conducted. And I'm talking about Jen Wood's conversation with Victoria. For those of you who don't know her, Victoria is the first survivor of the Cheer Incorporated child sex abuse scandal to come forward and tell her story, in her words, in her voice. This conversation, again, one of the most compelling things we've ever put on film. Here's a quick excerpt from Jen's conversation with Victoria.
Are there parts of this process that you think have been particularly difficult?
Yeah. So this is the hardest one for me. Because I was asked about one of the perpetrators and whether or not they abused me.
At the time it was happening?
Shortly after.
Right.
I don't remember exactly how long. And I lied. I said, no, that's just a rumor. And this person was concerned. And they asked me again. And I lied again. Because I was scared. And I look back now. And I wonder, what if I just would have told the truth? Because that was 18 years ago. And maybe 18 years worth of kids being abused might not have happened. And that kills me to think about. And I know I can't save the world. But even if it just would have saved one.
I think as moms we try.
Yeah.
We do keep talking about this over and over, that
one hurts.
Yeah.
And I think about it ever since this has happened.
Do you think that's part of why you're here?
Absolutely. Yeah. it was the day when I found out that there were over 100 people who have called in. That was it for me. I called Bakari. So that made me sick to my stomach. And yeah, it's just something that I know it's not my fault. I know that. But as human, it's hard to not think about it.
Right.
So.
Once again, if you haven't already, please download, listen to, share, and if you like, write a review for Cheer Incorporated. This is the kind of stuff that the mainstream media just isn't doing to hold this entire system, this entire industry accountable. Once again, Cheer Incorporated on Apple, Spotify, wherever you download your podcast. That's a wrap for this week. Obviously, an incredibly full edition. We've got huge weeks coming up on the Week in Review, folks, as we start transitioning our operations down to Walterboro, South Carolina for the big Murdaugh murder trial. Count on FITSNews to continue leading that coverage. But once again, appreciate you tuning into this episode of the Week in Review. We'll catch you next time.